What if I told you that a single fruit, one you've probably eaten this week, maybe even today, helped topple empires, sparked religious wars, inspired the greatest scientific mind in history, built a billion-dollar industry, and fundamentally changed the way human civilization spread across the entire planet? No, seriously, one fruit. Round, crunchy, sweet, familiar. You know the one, the apple. Now, before you click away thinking this is some dry, dusty history lesson, let me give you just a glimpse of what we're going to cover in the next 40 minutes, because I promise you the real story of the apple is nothing like what you learnt in school. Did you know that the apple you bite into today is almost genetically identical to a wild fruit that grew in a remote mountain range in Central Asia, a place most people couldn't find on a map? Did you know that the apple became the most powerful symbol in Western religion and mythology, not because of any divine decree, but largely because of one ancient translator's mistake? And did you know that one eccentric American wanderer, a barefoot, tin pot hat-wearing man, who most people think was a children's fairy tale, actually changed the course of American history more profoundly than most generals and presidents? The apple is not just a fruit. It is, in the most literal sense, a story of humanity itself. It has traveled with us, adapted with us, fed us, inspired us, and shaped the world we live in, and nobody talks about it, not really. Not the full story. So pour yourself a drink, get comfortable, and let's go all the way back, not to a garden in the Middle East, not to a Newton family orchard, not to an American frontier, but to a wild, forested mountain range in a country called Kazakhstan, thousands of years before any of that, because that is where this story truly begins. The Tian Shan mountain range. If you've never heard of it, picture a vast, rugged stretch of mountains that runs through what is today southeastern Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and into China. It is remote, beautiful, and ancient. And it is, according to modern geneticists and botanists, the birthplace of the apple, not a cultivated apple. Not anything like what you'd find at a grocery store, but a wild species called Malus sieversii, a small, somewhat gnarly tree that grows along the mountain slopes and valleys of the Tian Shan, producing fruit that can range from bitter and small to surprisingly sweet and large, depending on the individual tree. This wild variation is the key to the entire story, and we'll come back to it again and again. For millions of years, these trees grew, spread, cross-pollinated, and evolved in isolation. Bears ate the fruit and spread the seeds. Birds pecked at the fallen apples and moved across the valleys. The forest was alive with genetic experimentation that nobody orchestrated, nobody planned, and nobody noticed. Then, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, something changed. Human beings arrived in the Tian Shan. Nomadic people, hunters and gatherers, and eventually early traders and pastoralists, and they found the wild apple forests. And here's the thing about wild Malus sieversii. Unlike most wild fruits, which tend to be uniformly bitter and unpleasant, these trees were wildly variable. You could walk through the forest and find a dozen different trees producing a dozen different kinds of fruit. Some sour, some bland, some, if you were lucky, genuinely sweet and delicious. Early humans did what early humans always do when they find something good. They kept coming back. They learned which trees produced the best fruit. They likely began moving seeds and seedlings, planting them near campsites and settlements. This is the beginning of apple cultivation, and it happened so long ago that we have no written record of it. We know it happened only because of genetics. Modern scientists like Dr. Barry Juniper of Oxford University spent decades studying apple DNA and traced the domestic apple's ancestry back to this specific wild species in Kazakhstan with remarkable precision. And here is perhaps the most astonishing genetic fact about the apple. It shares roughly 57,000 genes with humans. For comparison, we humans have around 30,000 protein-coding genes. The apple has nearly twice as many. This isn't a coincidence. It's a consequence of millions of years of genetic complexity, of the apple adapting to every kind of environment, every kind of pollinator, every kind of predator. The apple is, in the most scientific sense, one of the most genetically sophisticated fruits on Earth. But genetic complexity alone does not explain how a wild mountain fruit became the most widely cultivated tree fruit in the world. For that, we need roads. Specifically, we need what would eventually become the most famous road in history. Think about what it means to move a fruit across a continent before motorized transport, before refrigeration, before packaging. You're dealing with something that bruises, rots, and dies. Moving fruit across vast distances seems almost impossible, and yet the apple did it. It traveled from Central Asia through Persia, through the Middle East, through Greece and Rome, and eventually to the far edges of Europe. And it did so across thousands of years along the trade routes we now collectively call the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a sprawling network of overland and maritime routes, connecting China and Central Asia to the Mediterranean world. It moved silk and spices, yes, but it also moved ideas, religions, diseases, and food. Merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and pilgrims all traveled these routes, and they carried with them seeds, pits, and grafts of every fruit they encountered. The apple moved westward along these routes, carried in the packs of merchants and in the memories of farmers. When a trader tasted an unusually good apple in a market in Samarkand, which sits in modern-day Uzbekistan, he might carry its seeds, or even a cutting all the way to Persia. A Persian farmer might then cultivate it, select the best specimens, and trade those onwards toward Greece or Egypt. Each handoff was another round of selection and adaptation. The apple was slowly, imperceptibly being domesticated, not by any one person or civilization, but by the cumulative choices of thousands of individuals over centuries. By the time we reach ancient Persia, the Achaemenid Empire, the most powerful civilization in the world between roughly 550 and 330 BCE, the apple was already a cultivated, valued crop. Persian orchards were famous throughout the ancient world. The concept of a paradise, the Persian word perideisa, meaning a walled garden, was centered around fruit trees. The apple was a paradise fruit, a luxury, a symbol of abundance, and then Alexander the Great swept through Persia in the 4th century BCE, and in doing so he connected the eastern Mediterranean world to Central and South Asia in ways that had never been seen before. His armies didn't just conquer, they collected. Botanists traveled with Alexander's campaigns, cataloguing plants and foods. Among the things that moved westward in the wake of Alexander's conquests were apple varieties, farming techniques, and the concept of the cultivated orchard. By the time the story reaches the Greeks and Romans, the apple has already traveled 2,000 miles from its birthplace. And in those civilizations it would find its most powerful cultural life yet, wrapped in the stories of gods and heroes, written into myths that would echo for 3,000 years. Let's talk about mythology, because you cannot tell the history of the apple without spending serious time here. The apple appears in the mythology of virtually every civilization it touched, and the stories are remarkably consistent in one way. Apples represent power, desire, temptation, and immortality. Always, in every culture. That is not a coincidence. In Greek mythology, the apple shows up repeatedly and always at the center of the action. The most famous example is the apple of discord, a golden apple thrown by Eris, the goddess of discord, inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Paris of Troy was chosen to judge who deserved it. Each goddess bribed him. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. He chose her. She gave him Helen of Sparta, and that choice, brokered by a fruit, launched the Trojan War, one of the most consequential events in all of ancient mythology, and its catalyst was an apple. Then there is Atalanta, the fierce, fast huntress who refused to marry unless a suitor could outrun her. The hero Hippomenes carried 3 golden apples given to him by Aphrodite, and when Atalanta began to overtake him in the race, he rolled the golden apples across her path. She stopped to pick them up, distracted by their beauty and power, and Hippomenes won the race. Apples, again, as instruments of desire and decision. The Norse had their own version. In the Eddas, the great Norse mythological texts, there is a goddess named Idun, and she is the keeper of the golden apples of immortality. The gods of Asgard must eat these apples regularly to maintain their youth and power. Without Idun's apples, the gods would age and wither. The apple is literally the source of divine life. This is not a minor detail. In Norse cosmology, the fate of the gods themselves depends on a fruit. Then we arrive at the story that has arguably done more to shape Western culture than any other, and one that most people think they know but don't, not fully. We're talking about the Garden of Eden. And here, the apple's story becomes perhaps most surprising of all, because the Bible, in its original texts, never actually mentions an apple. You heard that right. The book of Genesis describes a forbidden fruit, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It does not specify what kind of fruit it was. It is simply called fruit. So how did the apple end up at the center of the most famous story in Western religious history? The answer lies in a 4th century translation. In the late 380s CE, a scholar named Jerome was commissioned by Pope Damasus I to create a definitive Latin translation of the Bible, a text that would come to be called the Vulgate and would remain the standard Bible of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. When Jerome translated the relevant passages in Genesis, he used the Latin word malum for the forbidden fruit. In Latin, malum means both apple and evil. The linguistic connection between the fruit and sin was, whether intentional or not, baked into the most widely read religious text in European history. For over a millennium, European Christians looked at an apple and saw sin, temptation, the fall of humanity. The fruit that broke paradise. This is extraordinary. One word, one translation choice, and the apple became the most loaded symbol in Western civilization. That weight, that combination of beauty, desire, and transgression, has followed the apple into art, literature, and culture ever since. Every painting of the Garden of Eden, every reference to the forbidden fruit, every time we call something tempting, we are echoing that one Latin word in Jerome's translation. The apple was already important before this. But after Jerome's Vulgate, it became mythologically invincible. While mythology was busy making the apple immortal in the imagination, the Romans were doing something equally important in the real world. They were engineering it. The Romans were extraordinary agricultural scientists, pragmatic, systematic, and obsessive about improvement. And when it came to apples, they developed and refined a technique that would fundamentally change the relationship between humans and fruit for all of history. That technique was grafting. Here is why grafting matters, and this is one of those facts that will genuinely change how you think about apples forever. Apples do not grow true from seed. If you plant a seed from a Honeycrisp apple, you will not get a Honeycrisp tree. You will get something entirely different. Unpredictable, unknown, possibly wonderful, possibly terrible. This is because apples are what scientists call highly heterozygous, meaning their genetic material is extraordinarily varied and does not replicate itself faithfully through seeds. Every apple grown from seed is essentially a unique individual, a genetic experiment. This is actually why the wild apple forests of Kazakhstan were so diverse in the first place. But for a farmer who wants consistent, reliable, delicious fruit, this is a nightmare. How do you reliably reproduce the one perfect apple tree you found, if planting its seeds gives you something completely different every time? The answer is grafting. You take a cutting, a small branch or bud from the tree you want to reproduce, and you attach it to the root system of another apple tree. The cutting grows, drawing nutrients from the rootstock, and produces a tree that is genetically identical to the original. It is essentially cloning, done with a knife and some string, thousands of years before the word clone existed. The Romans mastered this technique. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described in remarkable detail the process of grafting apple trees, and he listed dozens of apple varieties that Roman orchardists were cultivating with pride. Roman writers classified apples by flavor, texture, season, and use. Some were for eating fresh, some were for making cider, some were for drying and storing through winter. The Romans approached apple cultivation with the same systematic rigor they brought to engineering and law. And when the Roman Empire expanded, its apple orchards went with it. Roman soldiers planted apple orchards wherever they settled, in Gaul, in Britain, in the Rhine Valley, in North Africa. The apple was not just food for the Romans, it was infrastructure. A planted orchard was a statement of permanence, a marker of civilization. When you planted an apple orchard, you were saying, "We are not leaving." So as Roman legions carved roads through the wilderness of northern Europe, they left behind something that would outlast the empire itself: apple trees. And in the centuries after Rome fell, those trees and the knowledge of how to cultivate them were kept alive in monasteries. The Catholic Church, which inherited much of Roman administrative and agricultural culture, became the unexpected guardian of apple cultivation through the Dark Ages. Monks in France, England, and Germany maintained orchards, developed new varieties, and kept the art of grafting alive in the otherwise chaotic centuries following Rome's collapse. Without those monks, without those monastery orchards, quietly tended through centuries of war and plague and political upheaval, the European apple tradition might have died. The apple owes a debt to people who rarely get credit in its history, the patient, devoted, anonymous monastics of medieval Christendom. If you're enjoying this journey through the incredible history of the apple, now's a great time to hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and there's so much more fascinating story still to come. We're not even to Newton yet. When most people think of apples in medieval Europe, they picture a simple, wholesome fruit eaten by peasants. The reality is far more interesting and far more intoxicating, literally. The medieval period in Europe was, in large part, the age of cider. And to understand why, you have to understand the problem of water. In medieval Europe, clean drinking water was not a given. Rivers and wells were frequently contaminated. Drinking untreated water was a reliable way to get seriously ill. What people needed was a beverage that was safe, that had been through some process that eliminated pathogens. Alcohol, produced by fermentation, was that process. So across Europe, communities produced fermented beverages as a practical matter of survival. In the Mediterranean, that meant wine. In the colder north, where grapes didn't grow well, it meant cider. Cider from apples, hard cider, as Americans would call it today, was not a casual drink or a novelty, it was a staple. In Normandy, in the English West Country, in the Basque region of Spain, in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, cider was the everyday beverage of working people. Whole economies were built around it. Apple orchards weren't just farms, they were breweries. The varieties of apple that were cultivated during this period were often selected specifically for cider production, bitter, tannic, high in sugar, not for eating raw. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, brought with them their superior cider-making knowledge and their beloved Norman apple varieties. This is one reason the English West Country, Somerset, Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, developed such a rich and enduring cider tradition. The Norman conquest wasn't just a political event, it was an agricultural one. It transformed what English people drank. Meanwhile, the cultivation of eating apples was advancing too. Throughout the medieval period, a gradual process of selection and refinement was creating new varieties. Each monastery, each great estate, each ambitious orchardist was trying to produce something better, sweeter, more beautiful. The language around apples in this period is striking. Medieval writers described their favorite apple varieties with the kind of reverence and sensory detail that we might use today for fine wine. The apple had become, in the fullest sense, a sophisticated cultural object. By the late medieval period, Europe had hundreds of distinct apple varieties. Regional varieties developed in isolation, adapted to local climates and soils. A traveller moving from Normandy to Kent to the Rhine Valley would find apples unlike anything they had tasted before at each stop. The apple's extraordinary genetic versatility, that same wild heterozygosity that confounded farmers who tried to grow it from seed, had become, through centuries of selection, one of humanity's greatest horticultural achievements. And all of that diversity was about to be put on a ship and sent to the New World. The European colonization of the Americas is one of the most written about events in history. The politics, the violence, the disease, the displacement, these are rightly at the center of our understanding of what happened when the Old World collided with the New. But there is a quieter, slower story running alongside all of that. The story of how European plants and animals remade the American landscape. The apple arrived in North America with the earliest European colonists. The Pilgrims brought apple seeds to Massachusetts in the 1620s. Spanish missionaries brought apple trees to California and the Southwest. French colonists planted apple orchards along the St. Lawrence River. Apple cultivation spread along the eastern seaboard of North America because it served the same purpose it had served in medieval Europe. It was the foundation of the cider industry, and cider was the safe, practical, socially accepted beverage of colonial life. Here is something that fundamentally changes how many Americans think about their country's history. The founding fathers were cider drinkers. Thomas Jefferson had an extensive apple orchard at Monticello and was passionate about cider. John Adams drank hard cider every morning for breakfast throughout his adult life and credited it with his longevity. He lived to 90. George Washington ran one of the most productive cider operations in Virginia. When we picture the founding of America, we tend to picture liberty and democracy and idealism. We should also picture apple orchards stretching to the horizon and barrels of fermenting cider. But of all the apple stories in American history, none is stranger, more beloved, or more misunderstood than the story of John Chapman, the man the world knows as Johnny Appleseed. The popular version of Johnny Appleseed is a children's story. A sweet, gentle man who wandered the frontier scattering apple seeds out of the goodness of his heart, bringing sweetness and nourishment to the pioneer wilderness. The reality is both more interesting and more complicated. John Chapman was born in Massachusetts in 1774, and he did indeed spend decades planting apple nurseries across the American frontier, particularly in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. But he was not a wandering altruist. He was a businessman. And here is the key detail that most people don't know. The apple trees that Chapman planted were not the kind you eat fresh. They were seedling trees, grown from seed, not grafted, which meant they produced small, bitter, unpredictable fruit. Virtually useless for eating, perfect for cider. Chapman was, in effect, a traveling cider supply entrepreneur. He would arrive in a new frontier region, plant a nursery of apple seedlings, leave them in the care of a local settler, and return years later to sell the grown trees to homesteaders. Under the terms of the Land Act of 1792, a settler could claim land if they planted a certain number of apple or pear trees, so Chapman's nurseries served a legal function too. He was helping people establish land claims as much as he was feeding them. He was also a devoted follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish mystic philosopher, and he preached Swedenborgian theology to frontier settlers alongside his apple sales. He walked barefoot or in crude sandals, wore a tin pot on his head as a hat. This detail is actually true, and traveled alone through wilderness that would have terrified most men of his era. He died in 1845, having planted enough apple trees to cover hundreds of thousands of acres of American frontier. He was a genuine original, one of the most eccentric and consequential figures in American agricultural history, and the sanitized children's version does him a strange disservice by making him merely sweet when he was actually something far more fascinating. We cannot tell the history of the apple without addressing perhaps the most famous apple story in the history of science, even though, spoiler alert, it almost certainly did not happen the way everyone thinks it did. The year is 1666. England is reeling from the Great Plague. Isaac Newton, a 23-year-old Cambridge student, has retreated to his family home at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire to wait out the epidemic. He is already one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of his age, and in the remarkable productivity of these isolated months, sometimes called his annus mirabilis, or miracle year, he lays the groundwork for calculus, optics, and the laws of motion. And then, the story goes, he sat under an apple tree in his garden, an apple fell, struck him on the head, and the question why did it fall led directly to his theory of universal gravitation. The apple tree, the falling fruit, the flash of insight, it is one of the most enduring images in the history of human knowledge. Here is the more complicated truth. Newton himself, in his old age, did tell a version of this story to multiple people. He described watching an apple fall from a tree in his garden and being prompted to think about the nature of gravitational attraction, why an apple always falls perpendicular to the earth, and whether this force might extend all the way to the moon. So the apple, and some version of the observation, may well be real. What is almost certainly fictional is the idea of it hitting him on the head, and the idea of a single sudden flash of insight. Newton's theory of gravitation developed over years of grinding mathematical work, but the story, even in its embellished, dramatized form, contains a genuine insight about how scientific genius works. Newton's greatness was not in watching an apple fall. Every human being who ever lived has watched an apple fall. His greatness was in asking the right question, why? And then having the mathematical tools, the intellectual discipline, and the sheer tenacity to work out the answer. The apple is a symbol of curiosity turned systematic. The tree, by the way, still stands at Woolsthorpe Manor, or rather a tree believed to be a descendant of the original still grows there. It is a variety called Flower of Kent, a large green cooking apple, not particularly sweet. It has been grafted and propagated repeatedly. Descendants of it grow in scientific institutions around the world, including the MIT campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the National Physical Laboratory in Britain. Newton's apple tree has become, like everything else in this story, a symbol far larger than the fruit itself. Let's take a moment, a breath from the sweep of history, and talk about what an apple actually is from a biological and nutritional standpoint. Because the science is genuinely astonishing, and it helps explain why this fruit has been so universally valued across cultures and centuries. The apple is a member of the rose family, Rosaceae, which also includes pears, cherries, plums, and peaches. When you look closely at an apple blossom, the rose connection becomes obvious. The five-petaled flower is unmistakably related to its garden cousin. The fruit itself is technically what botanists call a pomme, which means it develops primarily from the enlarged receptacle of the flower rather than from the ovary wall. The core of the apple, the part you typically don't eat, is the true fruit. The fleshy part you do eat is, botanically speaking, an enlarged floral tissue. The apple is in the most literal sense made of flower. An apple contains a remarkable array of beneficial compounds. Beyond the obvious vitamins, a good dose of vitamin C, some B vitamins, and vitamin K, apples are rich in a class of antioxidants called flavonoids, and particularly in a compound called quercetin, which has been studied for its potential anti-inflammatory effects. They contain pectin, a soluble fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria and helps regulate cholesterol. and they contain a range of polyphenols that modern researchers are investigating for their potential roles in reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. An apple a day keeps the doctor away is not just folk wisdom. It has a reasonably solid scientific basis, at least in the sense that regular apple consumption is correlated with several positive health outcomes in epidemiological studies. The saying itself dates to a Welsh proverb from 1866, "Eat an apple on going to bed, and you'll keep the doctor from earning his bread." A little more specific than the version we know today, the smell of an apple, that clean, sweet, distinctive scent, comes from a complex mix of over 300 volatile chemical compounds, many of them esters and alcohols that are produced as the fruit ripens. The specific combination varies by variety, which is why a Fuji smells different from a Granny Smith, which smells different from a Golden Delicious. Each variety is essentially playing a different chemical chord, and the crunch, that deeply satisfying snap, comes from the structure of the apple's cells. Mature apple cells are turgid with water, packed tightly together, and when you bite through them, they rupture simultaneously and release that burst of juice and sound. When an apple goes soft with age, it's because these cells have lost their internal pressure and no longer rupture cleanly. The crunch is a sign of freshness, of cellular integrity, of a fruit at its peak. And we find it satisfying because evolution has trained us to associate that sound with exactly that, food at its nutritional best. Here is a genuinely heartbreaking chapter in the history of the apple, one that very few people know about, but that matters enormously for understanding the food world we live in today. Before the Industrial Revolution and the rise of commercial agriculture, the apple world was extraordinarily diverse. In the United States alone, by the early 19th century, there were estimated to be between 14,000 and 16,000 distinct named apple varieties. Think about that number for a moment. Over 15,000 different apples, each with its own name, flavor profile, texture, season, and use. Many were intensely local, a variety known only in a particular county in Virginia or a particular valley in upstate New York, prized by the families who had cultivated it for generations. Names like Newtown Pippin, Cox's Orange Pippin, Baldwin, Northern Spy, Roxbury Russet, Black Twig, Winesap, hundreds more that most people have never heard of and never will. Then came industrialization. Commercial agriculture demanded standardization. Railroads meant apples could be shipped long distances, but only if they survived the journey. Supermarket chains demanded consistent appearance, uniform size, predictable shelf life. The messy, glorious diversity of the heirloom apple world was ruthlessly winnowed down to a handful of commercially viable varieties. By the late 20th century, the overwhelming majority of apples sold in American supermarkets were just a few types: Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, Macintosh, and Fuji, 5 varieties in a world that had once had 15,000. The Red Delicious is the most famous casualty of this homogenization. Originally a genuinely delicious apple discovered in Iowa in the 1870s, sweet, complex, with a satisfying texture, the Red Delicious was so commercially successful that growers over the following century selectively bred it purely for appearance. It became redder, shinier, more uniformly shaped, longer lasting, and in doing so it lost almost everything that had made it good to eat. By the 1990s, the Red Delicious was widely considered the worst apple in the supermarket. Mealy, bland, starchy, despite being the most popular by sales volume. It is the perfect symbol of what industrial agriculture does to food when appearance and shelf life trump flavor. But there is a recovery story here too. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, a community of dedicated horticulturists, farmers, and food activists began the painstaking work of tracking down and preserving heirloom apple varieties. Organizations like Slow Food, the Rodale Institute, and various regional apple societies began cataloging old orchards, seeking out ancient trees in abandoned farmsteads and overgrown pastures, and grafting cuttings to preserve genetic material that would otherwise be lost forever. It is, in its quiet way, one of the great preservation stories of our time. Today, the Honeycrisp, developed at the University of Minnesota and released in 1991, represents a new chapter. Bred specifically for flavor and that explosive crunch, it broke the commercial apple industry's assumption that what shoppers wanted was appearance over taste. The Honeycrisp was the first apple in generations that people talked about the way food lovers talk about wine. It sparked an apple renaissance that is still unfolding. Let's bring this all the way to the present, and then, briefly, to the future, because the story of the apple is very much still being written today. The apple is the most widely cultivated tree fruit in the world. Approximately 80 million metric tons of apples are produced annually. A number so large it barely registers, but try to picture it. If you stack that many apples end to end, the pile would stretch from the earth to the sun and back. China is by far the world's largest producer, accounting for roughly half of all apples grown globally. The United States is second, with Washington state alone producing around 60% of American apples. Other major producers include Turkey, Poland, India, and Italy. The European apple industry is particularly focused on quality. Regions like South Tyrol in northern Italy and the Loire Valley in France produce apples that are marketed and consumed with the same regional pride as their wines. Globally, there are now between 7,000 and 8,000 commercially known apple varieties, though only a fraction are widely grown. New varieties are constantly being developed through traditional breeding programs at agricultural universities and through modern genetic science. Companies spend decades and hundreds of millions of dollars developing a new commercial apple variety because the economic rewards are immense. The Cosmic Crisp, a cross between the Enterprise and the Honeycrisp developed at Washington State University and released in 2019, was the subject of the largest apple marketing campaign in history. A single variety, a single fruit, and the future? It is being shaped by climate change, by shifting consumer tastes, by genetics, and by technology. Rising temperatures are pushing traditional apple-growing regions northward and to higher altitudes. Traditional apple-growing areas in lower elevations are becoming warmer than optimal, while new areas in northern Scandinavia, Canada, and at altitude in the Himalayas are becoming suitable for the first time. The apple, as it has done for 10,000 years, is adapting and moving. Scientists are also returning to where this story began, to the wild apple forests of Kazakhstan and the Tian Shan Mountains, to look for genetic traits in wild Malus sieversii that could be bred into commercial varieties to improve disease resistance, climate adaptability, and nutritional content. The genetic library of the wild ancestor, preserved by millions of years of evolution, may hold solutions to problems that modern agriculture has not yet fully faced. And in orchards around the world, something beautiful is happening. Farmers are rediscovering heirloom varieties. Cideries are reviving the art of small batch, traditional fermentation with heritage apples. Chefs are seeking out unusual varieties for their restaurants. A generation of young people who grew up eating only 5 kinds of apple are discovering that there is a universe of flavor they have never tasted. The apple has been many things across its extraordinary history. A wild fruit in a remote mountain forest. A trade commodity on the Silk Road. A mythological object wielded by gods. A symbol of sin and knowledge in the world's most widely read book. The foundation of colonial economies and American frontiers. The catalyst, real or legendary, for one of science's greatest achievements. An industrial product stripped of its soul and then slowly, painstakingly, lovingly recovered. It is above all else a story about us. About what we value, what we cultivate, what we preserve, and what we let go. Every apple variety that disappeared over the last century was a human story ending. Every heirloom tree rescued from an overgrown orchard is a human story continuing. And every new variety developed in a laboratory in Washington or Minnesota or China is a human story beginning. The apple has been with us since before we had cities, before we had writing, before we had any of the things we consider civilization. And if we are wise enough, if we tend the wild forests and the heirloom orchards and the genetic diversity that took millions of years to develop, it will be with us for a very long time to come. That is the history of the apple, not a fruit, a world. And that's a wrap on the full history of the apple, from a wild mountain forest in Kazakhstan all the way to your kitchen counter. If this video gave you something to think about, please take 1 second to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It makes a huge difference and helps stories like this one find more people who love them. Thank you so much for spending 40 minutes with me. I'll see you in the next one.